Hello and welcome to your first video for ENG5113 Studies in World Literature for summer 2019. Apologies for the delay with getting this done. I was on the road for the last 2 days, so if I look absolutely exhausted and sound a bit incoherent, at least I have an excuse this time. Okay, so we are just I just want to briefly go through a couple of things right now. The first thing I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the overall purpose of the course, and then talk about the sort of shape of the course in terms of like what the assignments are going to be, how they build on one another and stuff like that. I'll talk a little bit then about this unit, the first unit of the course that we're starting today. And finally, I'll talk about this week's assignment and what the sort of expectations are for it, and why we're doing it and what sort of purpose it serves. So in terms of the course itself, as you can see from the course schedule, which I hope you read, the purpose of it obviously is to talk about how literature in the contemporary era relates to the city, how it represents the city, and how writers think about our individual relationship to the city, as well as our collective relationship to the city, the sense of belonging, the sense of community, and the sense of society that's created by living in contemporary cities. I'm specifically interested in how the contemporary city might be different to earlier eras, right? So there's we've been living in cities for millennia, but in the last couple of 100 years, cities have become increasingly industrialized places. They've become much larger places, and they've also become the center of economic activity, first in the Western world, but later throughout the world and in the global South. And now, for the first time in human history, the majority of humans live in cities. This is unprecedented, and it means that cities are now officially central to human life. But I'm also interested in the way that the contemporary city has some particular qualities of its own as a global city that did not necessarily exist in earlier eras. And I'm interested in exploring how world literature responds to the very particular challenges of contemporary capitalist cities. The fundamental point that sort of links all of our texts and all of the cities that we'll be looking at together is that they are all part of a world system of cities, a network, if you will, of cities that are interlinked together by economic activity, by the movement of people, whether immigrants or financiers, people in the upper tiers of capital or the lower. And those links across the world are in many cases more important than the links of those cities to their immediate hinterlands. So, for example, the city of London is in huge cultural tension with the rest of England. It's very hostile, for example, to Brexit, and it's very sort of hostile to the sort of values that obtain in the rest of the country, and vice versa. The rest of the country doesn't tend to like London. But London has more economically in common with Paris or New York or Tokyo, and it also has more culturally in common with those cities than it does with the rest of the country around it. And that is an important cultural feature of a global city. So what I'm interested in is how literature responds to that sort of cultural challenge, as well as the economic challenges and so on that are posed by these global cities. And especially I'm interested in how does it change the way writers write. Okay, so if you look at earlier eras of literature, writers writing about the city have tended to structure their stories in a way that reflects the nature of the cities in which they live. So Charles Dickens writes these realist texts that tell the story of the 19th century industrial city. They show the class positions of the various characters and the interactions between them, and the evolving social situation of 19th century London. In the modernist era, we see writers like T.S. Eliot or James Joyce depict much more complex, fragmented, alienated cities where people have much less of a sense of belonging in the early 20th century to the place in which they live and the people all around them. And you get this literature that's often very fragmented, and the sort of sentence structures are all sort of blasted apart. And it reflects that sort of idea that the city is no longer a place where one feels coherent and whole, but rather one feels very much fragmented within oneself, but also very detached from the people around them. And I want to talk about how that sort of plays out in our contemporary era, when we have a much more globalized city where the actions of, say, a financier living in New York, as in Cosmopolis, the second novel that we'll be looking at, how his everyday actions are very much shaped by activities in Japan, in the yen currency market, much more so than what's happening just outside his car window. And that idea that in some ways we're constantly being shaped by actions and activities that are happening in totally different parts of the world, often that we're totally unaware of, is sort of crucial to the experience of city life. And I'm interested in how writers in this era respond to that, and how they shape their narratives to account for that. And it's not just the financier, the billionaire rich guy that is affected by this. It's just as much the Nigerian immigrant and his son in say T.J. Cole's novel that is affected by the same thing, that his life is in some ways shaped by things that are happening on the other side of the world, and histories that are part of a different space than New York, but they shape his experience of New York. And we can see that also, as we'll see in Unit 2, that these cities in the global south, like Johannesburg or Dhaka, are in no way immune from this idea of being globally interconnected, that when we're in a global city, we're in some sense communing with or in touch with forces that spread across the globe, forces of economics, forces of geopolitics, and so on. And I'm interested in how these writers respond to that stuff, right? And I'm especially interested in how you interpret their response to that stuff. And that's why I want to talk about the assignments and the sort of shape of this course, and how you're going to be engaging with that stuff. So the way that the course is structured is that in the early part of the course, we'll be doing several sort of assignments and so on that are relatively low stakes, right? The grading will be based a lot more on your ability to, or your willingness rather, to collaborate with one another and help one another out and support each other and challenge one another as well, be willing to disagree with one another, and building that idea of an intellectual community from whom we learn is going to be the focus of our first few weeks. So the assignments you're going to be doing will involve engaging with the key concepts in the course and with the texts. But in terms of the shape of these assignments, you'll be doing some work individually. You'll be reading on your own, obviously, and you'll be interpreting things on your own in some ways. But there will be a big emphasis at this early stage on working with your classmates and getting used to the idea that literary scholarship is not an individual activity. And especially when you're doing an online course, it can very much feel like it is an individual activity. But instead thinking of yourself as part of a scholarly community and drawing upon the knowledge of one another. And first of all, building a trust in one another, and then building a sort of mutual reliance, a sense that if there's aspects of this that I don't get, somebody can work with me to uncover those problems. So those early assignments will involve building that sense of trust and mutual reliance, while also dealing with a couple of key basic skills that I think we're going to need to progress in the course, namely close reading of texts, taking not just thinking about a novel in the very broad terms that we tend to do in big thematic ideas and stuff like that, but instead taking short passages of it and looking at how those passages are written, not thinking about the text as something that we have to look past to find out what the writer really meant, but instead looking at, well, how did they write this and why did they write it that way, and what sort of meaning does that yield when we start looking at it in that way. That's a really crucial part of what we're going to be doing here. So some of our early assignments are going to just be looking at short text, pieces of text, and thinking about, well, how much information can we mine from this? And also thinking about sort of traditional thematic argument around these things, right? But basically doing these sort of early assignments where you're going to be doing group tasks and discussion forums and stuff to work with one another on things like close reading and thematic argument, to lay that groundwork, both in terms of your sense of community and your sense of confidence in the skills you have. That will be the focus of Unit 1. In Unit 2, we'll build another crucial skill of this course, which is critical theory and argument, right? So thinking about say scholarly work on a novel, say an article about it, not just as something that you take information from and say, well, now I've learned that, but rather you think about, well, how did that person shape their argument? And how can I critique that argument? How can I maybe read it against the grain and think about other ways of thinking about this text, and maybe learning to be sort of critical in our approach to that type of writing. We'll also at that point begin proposing our major assignments, right? So you'll have laid down a base work of knowledge of the sort of texts we're looking at. You'll have a base work of work with your classmates, which, by the way, we'll now be dealing with in a slightly more complex way as you begin to give one another feedback and provide peer review to one another, not just working together on stuff to yield ideas, but working on each other's work so that you can challenge one another to do better. And so you'll be ready then to start proposing papers. And it's at that point in the final unit of the course, we'll really start to focus on your individual scholarly work, specifically your video presentation and your final paper, right? So as I've mentioned in the course structure, I think that those are the two major ways in which literary scholars communicate: conference papers, which your video presentation is an approximation of, and journal articles, which is what your final paper is going to imitate. And so we'll lay all that groundwork of scholarly community, close reading, critical theory and argument earlier in relatively low stakes, but increasing the stakes as we go along, but making sure that you build those skills before we tackle the idea of forming your full complex arguments in your video presentation and your final paper, so that by the time you get to do those, you'll be fully confident of your ability to do that and the skill sets that you need to do it. And at that point, we'll be very much emphasizing drafting. So you'll be spending a lot of time doing early drafts of these things, subjecting that stuff to the critique and encouragement of your classmates. And with the video presentation in particular, you'll also be imitating a conference, because you'll be subjecting that to extended question and answer sessions with your classmates, which is really how ideas are formulated and expanded and given depth, is by going to conferences and not just delivering a paper, but being ready for the kinds of feedback and the kind of responses that your peers will have to those things. So hopefully it'll be a very productive way of approaching this stuff, because it'll allow you to start thinking like a literary scholar. Okay, so that's the overall structure of the course as I see it. Just wanted to briefly mention the readings and the reading loads that you've got. You'll notice that we do have a lot of reading because you have novels that are coming week after week and so on. This week you'll notice that you've been split into two groups, so you're focusing on different aspects of the reading. I'll try and do that as much as possible week to week. You still have to read everything that's on there, but it'll make sure that you'll have a specific area of emphasis that you're going into much more depth on. And on the one hand, that'll allow you to lower the reading load, but it'll also get you used to the idea that you're relying on your classmates to help you get a broader understanding of the material. You'll provide the depth by going into a particular text, but your classmates will help provide the breadth by letting you think about, well, here's how we thought about this text, and you can respond to that and engage with their ideas while having your own area of concentration that week. And increasingly, you'll take more and more responsibility for what that area of concentration is going to be in a given week. Okay, so we're on to unit 1 now. So the first thing that we're doing in week 1 is looking at a couple of key texts in the history of the city. And these are not literary. Well, the Walter Benjamin one is a literary text in some ways because he's writing about the poet Charles Baudelaire. But all of these thinkers, George Simmel, Walter Benjamin, and Saskia Sassen, are famous thinkers about the city, right? So Simmel's essay focuses on the effect of the modern metropolis on the individual consciousness, the individual psyche. What are the psychological effects of living in a city? How does it change the way we relate to people around us? Walter Benjamin talks specifically about the flaneur, the figure of the person who idly walks the city, observing those around him, and in doing so gives us a sense of the overall texture of a city, while also being a sort of individual who's in some ways removed from the city around him, so a sort of contradictory figure in that way. Finally, Saskia Sassen is a very different type of writer who's writing in relatively technical terms about what a global city is and what the ingredients are that make a global city. For Sassen, I should say, a global city refers to major world cities like New York, London, and Tokyo, but we'll be using some of the ideas she presents for what constitutes a world city to think more broadly about how cities in general are sort of interlinked with the world around them. So you'll each be in a group that's assigned to one of those essays. There are other essays that are on there that I want you to have a read of, but they have slightly different focuses. One is by the Warwick Research Collective, which is a sort of group of world literature scholars who are basically explaining their idea of what world literature is and how it is essentially a way of reading literature. It's a way of thinking about how does literature relate to that world system around us, in the ways that I've been talking about, like, well, how does a writer of the city, for example, deal with the fact that every city is part of that world system of cities. The Mike Featherstone essay is a sort of updating of Walter Benjamin's discussion of the flaneur to talk about, well, what does the flaneur have to say about the modern city? And I think that might be a helpful essay to read in relation to Teju Cole's novel Open City, which really is the story of a flaneur walking around New York, modern New York, having random encounters with often very strange or unusual characters, and even going to other world cities that are sort of culturally linked, including Brussels, this sort of trip to Brussels in the middle of the novel. And what I want you to do in this opening assignment is, well, rather than just going straight into having a broad discussion of Teju Cole and what you thought of the city, of the novel Open City, is to immediately begin thinking about, well, what are some of the major concepts that have shaped the way that we think about the city, and and say, well, some of these ideas are quite old. Some of them are from the early 20th century. And do they still apply to the contemporary city? Or has the city changed so much that they're no longer relevant? But especially I wanted to be thinking about, well, how do those ideas help us to understand what a writer like Teju Cole is doing? His main character is a sort of transnational figure with one foot in Nigeria and the other foot very firmly in the United States. And in some ways, he represents multiple cultures at once. And he's neither a representative of Americanness nor of Africanness. He is a sort of in-between figure who is in some ways at a remove from the city around him, but also very conscious that that city is shaped by the global community in a way that maybe somebody who is, solely raised in one place might not have the same sense of. So I'm interested in, well, how do those ideas get reshaped or reformed in a novel like Open City, and how does it deal with those ideas? But as we'll see later in the unit, because next week you'll be looking at a shorter novel, Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis, where we'll be talking about, well, a very different view of the city of New York. It's from the window of a limousine being driven around and housing a billionaire financier in it. And we can start thinking about, well, in some ways, both of these guys are transnational figures. They both sort of are conscious of New York's position in a wider world. But how different are their ways of thinking about the world? What are the differences about what shapes their understanding of the city around them, and especially the way that they talk about space? So I'm especially interested in descriptions of urban space in these novels, and thinking about that not just as neutral, right? It's not just I'm describing beautiful architecture or interesting space for its own sake, but rather, well, how do the assumptions or the understandings of the world that these guys have, how do they shape the way they think about space? So if you look at in Open City, he's always very conscious of the fact that his African heritage and also his European heritage, his grandmother being German, his mother being German rather, how these things shape his understanding of the space and the people around him. And that's very different than in Cosmopolis, where you have this guy who is influenced by finance and money and how that shapes his understanding of the space around him, right? So we want to start thinking about how these sort of concepts of the city might help us to understand what these authors are doing. So the reason I want you to go straight into thinking about those concepts is to be like, okay, well, I want to be thinking about these not just as novels in general that I have a sort of personal response to, but thinking about them in terms of what they say about the city, how they engage with the cityscape that they describe. And so we're starting with New York because it is the world city. It's the most world city of all the world cities, right? And thinking about, well, how do writers deal with a place that in some ways encompasses every nation on earth? There's no nation on earth that doesn't have an immigrant community in New York. It is the center of the financial world. It's the center of the literary world. It's the center of immigration. It's a place where all of these aspects of the universe sort of converge in this one place, and so it's unsurprising that literature that comes out of there has a sort of quality of just being mesmerized by the complexity of it. And I'm interested in unpicking how that plays out. Okay, in terms of the actual grading, though, I'll give you a full rubric on this tomorrow. I'm really tired, so I haven't got this stuff all put together. But broadly speaking, the expectations for grading will be relatively low stakes. Not that it's an easy assignment to do, but rather that the expectations are more focused on having a clear understanding of of the essay that you read is important, but it's not the be all and end all. If you don't understand what's going on in the essay, it's just as acceptable to say, I didn't get it, I don't understand this bit. But what you need to do is you need to ask questions. You need to say, here's the part I didn't understand. Here's why I didn't understand it, or where I got lost. That's all fine. The really important part for your grade is that you're engaged in constructive engagement with your partners and your other classmates, right? That you show a willingness to support one another's readings, to build upon what the other person has said rather than just blithely agreeing, that you're willing to challenge one another's ideas, and yeah, you're willing to help one another out, that you're willing to reach out to the other person and say, okay, there's a part you didn't understand, maybe this is a way we could think about it, does that help, right? That willingness to engage with one another's ideas and help one another out when you don't have any ideas, that's what what the grade will be based on. Not so much the brilliance of an insight. It's not a competitive environment here. Your ability to work with one another is more important than your ability just to show off how good you are at reading, which I'm sure you guys are all fantastic at reading. I've no doubts about that. That's why I'm much more interested in how well you can work together. So that's kind of everything that I want to cover at the moment. I do want to emphasize, though, that I am there, right? I will be there to answer questions. I will engage with your discussions in the forum this week in the assignment as much as I can. And I'm more than happy to help. And if you're ever confused or if you ever have any ideas, I want you to get in touch. I want you to send me an email and we can talk about stuff. But I really want to emphasize the idea that your first port of call when you're confused about a text or when you're not sure what to do with something is one another, that you get in touch with each other and work that stuff out. Not because I don't really feel like answering questions or it's somehow beneath me to do that. I'm more than happy to do it. I love talking about these texts. I love talking about these ideas. This course is sort of helping me build my my current research work. My current book project is sort of based on the global city. So I'm happy to talk about this stuff, but I want to get you used to the idea that you're part of a scholarly community, so that you don't think, well, the instructor is the fountain of knowledge. I just go and ask him and he'll tell me the answer. That's fine, I can do it, but the real value you'll get from this course is understanding that idea of yourself as part of an intellectual community. And that doesn't just come into being, it's built slowly through increasingly relying on one another and trusting one another. And that starts with week one. It even starts with the introductory forum, just chatting with one another. It's not a trivial thing. It's an important aspect of establishing that sense of community, especially in an online course. But the first sort of assignment that we're doing, this group task, should help you get used to the idea that you can look to your classmates to help you. It's not part of this course that you're expected to understand everything straight away or show off just how brilliantly you've mastered stuff and things like that. That's cool if you do it, but the real emphasis here, especially in these first few weeks, is on that idea that you are working together, and it will actually inform your grade. So thank you, and sorry for the delay getting this video up. I hope this is helpful. I know I'm sort of rambling a little bit because I haven't had a huge amount of sleep, but yeah, do feel free to get in touch. I'll be engaging with you a little bit more directly as of tomorrow in the discussion forum. Thanks so much. Sorry for going on so long. I'll talk to you soon.